Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Matthew Linton, and I'm the Senior Manager for Programs and Publications at the Council of Graduate Schools. Before we get started with today's event, as the attendees are coming in, I just want to give you a quick rundown of a few webinar logistics. A reminder to please submit questions at any time through the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbar. But we will be answering those questions live only during the designated Q&A portion of today's event, which will occur after the presentations. A reminder that the recording and presentation slides will be emailed to all registrants, as well as posted on the CGS website and YouTube channel after the live event. Also, the chat is open, and you are welcome to use the chat to discuss the webinar with your fellow attendees. But remember, we will not be mining the chat for questions during the Q&A session. That will solely be through the Q&A feature. Sarah, next slide. So I'd like to welcome you to today's event, Making the Case for Incremental Credentialing in Graduate Education. This is a co-sponsored event between the Council of Graduate Schools and Credential as you go. As you can see, this event will be 1 hour and 30 minutes, and we're very excited that you've joined us today. Next slide. And with that, I would like to introduce Suzanne Ortega, President of the Council of Graduate Schools, as well as a member of the Credential as you go National Advisory Board, to set the context for today's presentations and do a brief introduction. Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Matt. And thank you, colleagues, for joining this conversation. I am so pleased to be having the opportunity to co-sponsor an event with our Credentials as you go colleagues, because today we really will explore important and understudied issues on the topic of micro credentials in the graduate space. You'll get a preview of a soon-to-be forthcoming CGS publication on this topic, and we'll learn more about important initiatives underway at Credentials as you go. I guess we hope collectively that today's seminar will help all of us, presenters and the audience, to better understand this really fast-moving area, but it will also help us crystallize the key questions that researchers and practitioners and policymakers must address in order to advance this practice. So, why graduate microcredentials and why CGS interest in it? First, I think of our first interest in microcredentials began with our interest in the master's degree. For much of the past decade, virtually all the growth in graduate enrollment has been driven by growth in master's and degrees. And the degrees themselves have long been sites of innovation, both in formats, delivery modalities, and curriculum. In fact, beginning in the early 2000s, graduate schools began implementing graduate certificates, at that time seen primarily as a complement to existing degree curricula, but also as short programs that allowed current employees to begin upskilling or reskilling. So at my university, the classic case was GIS. Lots of the folks in the ag department at the state and elsewhere needed to better understand these new schools. Well, more recently, growth in certificate programs has even more rapidly accelerated. In fact, we've seen year-over-year growth in the conferral of graduate certificates of around 20% in the last several years. This very last year, we saw a little bit of flattening by 1.2%, but it still is an astonishing increase. And I think that increase is partly due to the fact that graduate administrators and coordinators are really looking for more flexible ways to get, and less expensive ways for students to enter graduate degrees and rewarding careers. And it's also born of the real desire to respond to employer demands, particularly in those really volatile, fast-changing fields of healthcare, education, data science, and cybersecurity. However, to date, much of the research on microcredentials remains focused on sub-baccalaureate or pre-baccalaureate and baccalaureate level certifications and credentials, and examines them primarily as a fast track pathways to good careers for individuals who may have had their previous education disrupted or come from economically disadvantaged classes. But the micro-credential space is so dynamic and is so diverse that those pathways, the undergraduate pathways, are only part of what is happening. So to reiterate, micro-credentials have real relevance to graduate education in three major ways. First, we believe that they create more pathways to graduate education. Degree programs are a pretty substantial commitment, both in time and resources, and not every prospective student can undertake a full program degree. So an incremental approach to credentialing allows for students to take the amount of graduate education that works for them and their goals, and that frankly, they can afford. It also gives opportunities for a more customized approach to graduate education so that degrees and the credentials can be tailored to particular personal interests, career pathways, or workforce need. The second real reason micro-credentials are of relevance to graduate education is employer engagement. Graduate schools and graduate programs really recognize and are eager for opportunities to collaborate with employers. And micro-credentials is one arena in order to connect to and respond to employer demand for specific skills and the opportunities to work with employers on the development of curriculum for the employees they need. In fact, you'll find in the CGS report that Matt will discuss several of these employer case studies. And then the final point I want to make is the cost of graduate education. I really believe that one of the most pressing issues in higher education is cost. And micro-credentials at least presents one possible way to address cost by allowing students to pay incrementally for a degree through stacked certificates, or by allowing them to take lower cost standalone certificates or badges in skill areas they want. But since this is such a new field and several questions, well, more than several questions remain, and we will discuss many of them today, I do want to start out by highlighting three. First, we are challenged by a lack of agreement on terminology and language, which means that the lack of precision in the terms makes it very, very difficult to discuss and scientifically measure developments in the field. And that isn't all bad. Innovation is messy. It's difficult to pin down, but its very flexibility gives it presents opportunities to explore and through rapid prototyping, might call it, promising models of practice. It does, however, make assessing quality almost impossible. We just had a session at our annual meeting on trying to assess the quality of these emerging credentials, and real questions remain. Like, should we even use the same quality assessments for micro-credentials as degrees? Who should be involved in the assessments? Since many of these credentials were driven by workforce demand, is the quality of the credential best determined by content mastery or by outcomes, career outcomes of credential holders? And then the question of how we best gauge learner and indeed employer demand. Is it true? If you build it, they will come. The new CGS report found that many transcripted post-baccalaureate certificate programs were smaller, fewer than 12 students than we had expected. Yet we often hear that this micro-credential space is where the projected enrollment growth is likely to come. So how do we make sure that we're building programs that learners want and that employers want? And what policies can we put in place to make sure that programs that struggle will be changed or sunset? Though there is uncertainty, and you're going to hear more about this, this is a really exciting time in the micro-credentials field, and I'm so excited for the presentations today that will delve more deeply into this world. And I so look forward to your questions and your comments and moving our work together forward. Matt, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Next slide. So I'm excited today to present some findings from a forthcoming report that CGS is putting out on microcredentials in the master's degree, understanding the national landscape to support learners in the workforce. But before I get started, I'd like to make sure to thank my co-authors on this report, and you, Joe, Jeff Allum, and Madeline Rowe. This was a true team effort, and none of this would have been possible without their valuable contributions. I'd like to thank Sarah Breifogel for her work making this report look lovely, look beautiful with her layout skills. And I'd also really like to thank ETS for supporting the project's research, as well as a 2023 convening on the project. And finally, I'd like to thank the Non-Degree Credentials Research Network for their support, as well as providing a forum to showcase some initial data from this project. So with that, next slide. I'd like to just do a brief project overview to showcase a little bit of how we got to where we ended up in the report. So this project was an 18-month project that started in 2022 that was sponsored by ETS to examine the relationship between emerging post-baccalaureate microcredentials and the master's degree. Suzanne gave a good sense in her introduction of why we were interested in this topic. In addition to her comments, I would say that we knew that some of our member institutions were beginning to stack microcredentials into master's degrees, and we wanted to explore that further. And then also we had started to hear some of these framed as alternative credentials, and that some of the language around these emerging non-degree credentials was really kind of playing them against degrees. And we wanted to examine more closely whether or not that was actually the case. So we began our project by conducting 6 focus groups in October 2022 that included groups of graduate deans, higher education administrators, continuing education and extension professionals, national employer groups, as well as workforce experts. And it was during these focus groups that we came upon one of the major challenges for this project, and one that Suzanne briefly mentioned in her introduction, which was the lack of or inconsistent definitions of terms. And I'm hopeful that a Credential As You Go team will explore this further later on. But in our focus groups, participants were particularly vexed by the word microcredential, which for some denoted a specific type of credential offered at their institution, but more commonly was used as a blanket term to cover many different credential types. And that blanket did not always cover the same credentials at each institution, which was a challenge when putting out a national survey. So taking note of this trouble, we went to our advisory committee, and they advised us, and you'll see through the data in this report, to really focus on credit-bearing transcriptable graduate certificates in our survey. So all the survey data you see today will focus on transcriptable credit-bearing graduate certificates. And so with that in mind, we fielded 3 surveys in early 2023. We fielded a survey to graduate deans. We fielded a survey to graduate program directors, and we fielded an employer roundtable survey. We were also fortunate enough to partner with the National Association of Colleges and Employers to include new questions about graduate certificates in their recruiting benchmark survey, which went out in late spring 2023. And then to inform a series of 5 case studies that you'll find in the report, as well as to follow up on some of the questions that emerged during the focus groups and the surveys, we conducted over 20 Zoom interviews with various stakeholders. And that all kind of coalesced in a project convening that was held in June 2023 that had over 30 attendees from diverse stakeholder groups. And that convening is what really led to the major themes, ideas, and findings that will be published in this forthcoming report. Next slide. So beyond the project overview of the design, we were animated by kind of 4 core research questions. The 4 were: what role do graduate badges and certificates play in initial hiring decisions of employers? What role do graduate certificates play in reskilling and upskilling the current workforce? If master's degrees remain an employer preference for job entry or promotion, What skill set does the degree signal that shorter-term credentials don't provide? And then finally, what vehicles exist or can be developed that ensure quality and relevance of post-baccalaureate certificates and degrees to future workforce needs? And so as you can see, our research questions kind of focused on three interrelated themes. One being the relationship between non-degree credentials and degrees. The second being the intersection of non-degree credentials in the workforce. And then finally, determining the quality of these non-degree credentials, both from a university and an employer perspective. Next slide. Just a brief comment on survey methodology before we get into the findings. So the Graduate Dean Survey was in the field in January and February of 2023, and we had 211 responses out of 463 surveyed institutions. We followed that up with a program director survey in March 2023. This went into more detail about how these programs were developed and administered, and we had 298 responses to that survey. And the highlights I'll be covering in more detail as part of these 5 key findings. Next slide. So there's a lot in the report, but today, in the interest of time, we're going to focus on the 5 key findings that are outlined in the forthcoming report. There's great material in the case studies as well as other data reports that will be relevant, and we'll be sure to circulate that report to all registrants for today's webinar. So those 5 key findings are: 1, that post-baccalaureate certificates are best understood as part of a larger ecosystem that includes graduate degrees instead of as an alternative to degrees. 2, that many programs are new and have small enrollments, as Suzanne mentioned in her intro. 3, departments and programs remain the drivers of program creation. 4, assessing microcredential quality remains a question, particularly balancing quality with speed. And 5, stacking certificates is still in the development phase at many institutions. So I'm going to delve more deeply into each one of these 5 points, starting with the first point about post-baccalaureate certificates being best understood as part of a larger ecosystem that includes graduate degrees. Next slide. So on this slide, you can see we have a figure here where we asked our graduate deans, how likely do you believe it is that certificates will replace the graduate degree as a certificate of choice for employers? 62.3% said probably will not, 15% said definitely will not, and as you can see, 0% said definitely will. So there's a widespread belief among the dean community that they do not believe the certificates will replace degrees as the credential of choice for employers. And this is a recognition that degrees are still very valuable credentials and that employers value them and know what they are. However, this does not mean that certificates and other microcredentials do not have important roles to play in supporting learners and employers, as you can see by the testimonial in the yellow box. Certs and other microcredentials are valuable in specific skill or competency acquisition, while degrees also may provide other skills and competencies like critical thinking, communication, and independence that may be harder to measure and may take longer time to develop. So the testimonial says, quote, "A graduate certificate to me signals the student has gained a new skill or understanding of a specific subject or topic at a deeper level than undergrad. A master's degree implies increased knowledge of a topic or subject, but also includes further development of skills like critical thinking, problem solving, etc." Next slide. So we followed up the surveys with these interviews. And in the interviews, we began to pick up on some really interesting patterns of the ways that master's degrees and certificates worked in concert or complemented one another in ways that went beyond stacking. So I'm going to touch on 3 of the most popular, or the ways that we heard the most often, that these 2 types of credentials were working together. And we often heard this in terms of career pathway defining or relating degree to career in a more concrete or tangible way. And so the first way is that certificates were seen as a way that allowed learners to customize their master's degree to fit a specific career pathway. And a lot of times this was to bring in skills from another discipline or disciplines to signal interest in a specific career pathway or career trajectory. I've termed this in some other places light interdisciplinarity because it allows for some skills from other disciplines to migrate from one discipline to another without forcing a fundamental reevaluation of curriculum of a master's program. So one interesting example we heard in this realm was from one institution that had a jointly administered graduate certificate in data analytics that was jointly administered between a chemistry and a biology department. And this program was in an industry-rich area. And we had kind of assumed going in that this was going to be a way for master's graduates from that program to signal to industry that they had all these great data analytics skills to go with their chemistry and biology knowledge. But when we sat down and talked with the program director, we actually found something quite different, which was that actually these students were using this certificate to signal to academia. Many of these students were applying to PhD programs, and they found that PhD programs really valued the data analytics skills that these students were bringing. And so it was actually a way of signaling to PhD programs in academia that they had these other skills beyond what they were just learning in their master's program. And so I think that's also important to mention that while a lot of these programs are designed to really speak to industry, they may also have quite broad applicability in academia too, as academic programs get more interdisciplinary. A second way is perhaps not surprising, is a way to update master's degrees that a master's holder may have had for some time. So certs and other microcredentials can allow master's degree holders to gain new skills and competencies without going back for full degree programs. We heard that this was particularly important for certain technology fields where there was a lot of rapid change. And also we heard about it in teaching fields where new competencies and knowledge would be rewarded by promotion or pay raises. The third way that we oftentimes heard these certificates and master's programs working together was about actually the opposite of the first option, which is broadening career pathways and signaling a desire to have more career options from your master's degree program. And we often found that was by kind of using a certificate program to acquire a particularly desirable skill or set of skills that had broad applicability to several careers. Again, oftentimes data science or data analytics. But one interesting case that we heard was a women's studies certificate that was oftentimes taken by humanities master's students. And the students were taking that certificate because they found that it actually had a broad range of applicability, not only for students that wanted to go from the master's program to a PhD program, signaling that they could potentially teach or TA in courses or in departments beyond their home department, so maybe a interdisciplinary women's studies department, but also because there was interest in that certificate of employers that were looking in Title IX compliance. And so it was seen as a potential pathway into Title IX administration at universities or in corporate America. Next slide. So finding number 2 is that many programs are new and have small enrollments. So in our focus groups, and I've seen actually a little bit in the chat already, we oftentimes heard non-degree credentials framed as these major enrollment drivers, that they were going to be substantially growing and broadening enrollment. But we really did not find that as much as we got into the research for this project. Next slide. So as Suzanne mentioned, we found the median program size in our program level survey was at 12. And as you can see, there were some quite large programs as well. But this also means that there's a lot of programs that have fewer than 12 enrollees for the spring. And this is for the spring 2023 semester. So a lot of these programs are very small. And so we were surprised by this finding. This is one that really jumped out to us. So in our interviews, we followed up with a lot of program directors about why this might be the case. Next slide. And so we found that there actually may be a lot of really good reasons why programs have small enrollments. These may be circumstantial reasons, but they oftentimes are also by design. So the first and most common reason that we heard for why these programs may have low enrollments is that the programs were new. We oftentimes heard that programs had been launched either in the last year or year and a half, and that program directors expected enrollments to grow as the program became better established, as graduates started to get into the workforce and advertise and communicate the value of those programs. However, that was not the only thing that we heard. We also heard, as we got into the case studies in particular, that certificate programs sometimes grow out of an employer partnership. And that employer partnerships will sometimes restrict who's able to participate in the certificate program to the cohort of employees that are eligible. And so in that case, the certificate program is really small by design, and that oftentimes employers really value that small, intimate kind of community setting for those sorts of certificate programs. A third reason that we heard about why a program might be small is that a certificate program may be totally embedded or partially embedded in either one or multiple master's programs, and that those programs may then be the only places where you can draw enrollment from for those certificates. And so, which again, in that case, similar to the employer situation, you're really dealing with a restricted enrollment pool, and you're really having a small kind of limited community for the certificate by design. And then finally, another situation that we heard about, which is perhaps not so surprising, was folks saying that they didn't know why their program didn't have the enrollment that they were anticipating, but that they were hoping that it was going to grow and that they had started to undertake steps, whether it was new marketing or other strategies to try to grow enrollment. But I think one thing that's important to mention in this context with that question about enrollment is that since many of these programs really are designed to meet specific employer need, it may be important to make sure that these programs can be pivoted quickly and also potentially sunset if they're no longer meeting that employer or workforce need. Having clear and concise sunsetting as well as curriculum change and development programs or policies is really important for these types of employer-focused certificates. Next slide. So departments and programs remain the drivers of program creation. So we oftentimes stress the difference in framing non-degree programs in comparison to degree programs, when in reality, actually, what we heard was a lot of commonalities between these emerging credentials and degree programs. Next slide. So one area was in program development and administration. So we asked our graduate deans which units on your campus are responsible for developing and administering transcripted credit-bearing postgraduate certificates. And as you can see, the most popular choices were academic departments or programs and academic colleges, which is what we would expect from degree programs as well. This was backed up with what we heard in our focus groups and interviews. We heard a lot about the importance of faculty champions for program success. And that the major individuals that would be driving the creation of these programs, but also their successful administration, are going to be faculty who were invested in program success. Next slide. So this was not the only place where this commonality between degree and non-degree programs existed. So this current slide is displaying were a selection of the principles and values that came out of the June 2023 project convening. So after the 2 days of talking about graduate microcredentials, we sat down and we're basically like, what are some values and principles that we think could guide the kind of successful and ethical development and administration of these programs? And as you'll see, these 7 points are the ones that rose to the top. Student-centeredness, collaboration, responsiveness to industry, workforce, and learner demand, flexibility, clear, transparent policies, high quality, and promoting equitable access to meaningful work. So what jumped out to me in reviewing this document for the report was actually how much these principles and values also held for degree programs and were really just good guidance for program creation, which has really led me to wonder that, I think a lot of programs have more wisdom than they may suspect when it comes to developing these sorts of new credentials. And it's also an important reminder that what is new may not be as new as we think that it is, and that sometimes received wisdom and knowledge can be valuable even when operating in these new modalities. Next slide. So finding 4, assessing microcredential quality remains a question, particularly balancing quality with speed. This is something Suzanne mentioned in her introduction, and it's one of the major challenges in this arena. Next slide. So our Dean survey found that certificate programs are often being reviewed only every more than 3 years, and 27% are not being regularly reviewed at all. So this begs a number of questions. I think one is about whether or not, in some cases, the excitement of launching these programs has outpaced the creation of policies to review and assess them. I think that the other part that's interesting is about how much is portable from degree assessment to these sorts of new non-degree programs, or whether or not some new thinking, original thinking is going to be required, and thinking about program review and quality assurance for certificates and other micro-credential programs. So you'll notice the text next to the figure is another interesting point, which is what are the core data points that are being used to evaluate curriculum and the quality of certificates? And you'll see that the top choices are things that we hear about for degree evaluation: student learning outcomes assessment, size of enrollment, faculty qualification, completion rates. But further down the list, we got to career outcomes and employer satisfaction. And I think that it's really important when we're thinking about these emerging credentials as being really guided by workforce need and employer demand, to wonder if we need to have employers and career outcomes higher up on that list, and to make sure that they're really leading the way that we think about these programs being of high quality. Next slide. But it's not really all bad news when it comes to certificate quality. It definitely is one of the real questions. But one thing that emerged in the NACE survey was actually that employers view college and university certificates as being of particularly high quality compared to their competitors. So 75% of employers responded that college and university certificates were being seen as high or very high quality, compared to only 13.2% for online providers. And I think that that's really important to note, which is that employers view college and university certificates as being really valuable. And universities have a lot of credibility among employers as credential providers. And this may be an important point of entry, or a useful point of entry for graduate schools that are looking to work more closely with employers, and that employers do value what you do and value the quality of the product that is being put out. Next slide. So finally, the fifth and final finding, stacking certificates is still in the development phase at many institutions. Next slide. So according to the program director's survey, only about 50% of certificates are stackable. And that about 50% of certificates are also not leading to simplified admissions pathways to related degree programs. So we had heard a lot about stacking as a major value of these certificates, but we found that still 50% are not being stacked. So when we went into the interview portion afterwards and asked program directors why that might be the case, we got some really useful feedback and information about some good reasons why you may not want to be stacking your certificate. So one that we heard and that reflected some of the previous findings were that some certificates are already embedded into degree programs and intended really only to be taken in conjunction with a degree program, usually a master's degree. But the second and third points, the second point was that there were a lot of folks that were concerned about making sure that each part of the stack of certificates had value on its own to the learner. There's a recognition that not all learners are going to want to stack their certificate. So you have to make sure that each component of the stack can stand alone and be of value to the learner on its own. And then finally, the third, and potentially, I think the most interesting complication around stacking has to do with stacking sequencing. So sequencing stacks can be really challenging, since stacks are oftentimes really a point of access. For students, you want to create a lot of access points into your stack, but at the same time, you want to make sure that stack sequencing makes sense for all learners at whatever access point they're choosing. One, because you want to set the learner up for success. You don't want a learner to come into a stack at a point that they're not going to be able to succeed. But also, you don't want to create, particularly for advanced learners, a situation where they may take a stack, they may take one certificate in a stack and then have to take 2 or 3 other certificates that are not of value to them simply to complete the degree. So you want to try to make sure that the entire stack has value to the learner. And so this requires a lot of coordination. And it may also require other policies, such as recognition of prior learning policies to be in place. So this can also be a pretty complicated process, and that can take some time, which may also be one of the reasons why stacking is still something that's in process at a lot of institutions and not totally finalized. Next slide. So there's a lot more in this report that I didn't have a chance to get to today, but I wanted to, in the interest of time, to share those 5 key findings. Please keep a lookout for this report. We're hoping to publish it in the next couple of weeks, and we'll be sending a link to all registrants for the webinar with the report. It will be free, so you'll all have access to it. My email is there. Please get in contact with me if you have any questions. And I'm really excited now to pass the baton on to Nan Travers from Credential As You Go to present some of the fantastic work that they're doing. Nan?
Thank you, Matt. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you the incremental credentialing framework and how it can be used at the graduate level. I also want to encourage those of you participating today to use the chat to share how you're using incremental credentials at your institution. We'd really like to see the different ways that this is happening. Next slide. The Credential As You Go initiative uses the term incremental credentials to refer to all types of credentials that formally document learning. That includes things like the certificates, badges, microcredentials, but also degrees. And we're also seeing things like apprenticeships and other kinds of credentials. Incremental credentials captures learning acquired along the learning pathway and formally recognize and connect that learning to a larger context of work and school. They can be at the non-credit or the credit bearing. It can be at the undergraduate, but very much at the graduate level in higher ed. And it also is at any level within industry. They also can be at all different sizes. So when we talk about something like a micro-credential, we also see degrees as incremental. And you can think of like masters going to PhD as an incremental step. In this presentation, I'm going to really focus on the graduate level. Could you click the next one? Thank you. Some of these are already in existence, and some are just developing in this country as well as other countries out there. So you can see with my red circles there, these are the areas that we are already seeing this happening at the graduate level. And one example that is one that's coming up is also looking at apprenticeships that we're seeing in other countries to be at a graduate level as well. So when we think about incremental credentialing, we're really thinking about how to purposefully capture what people know and can do along the way to ensure also formal recognition of that learning. Next slide. The incremental credentialing framework was developed during the first phase, which started 5 years ago of Credential As You Go. And that first phase was funded by the Lumina Foundation. We've since obtained additional funding from the U.S. Department of Education in the IES division and also with Walmart. During that first phase, we conducted a landscape analysis across 41 states to examine the patterns in credentialing, and from that, we developed the framework. We tested and revised the framework, and this I'm going to briefly tell you about the current one. We have 6 approaches there, commonly that are used together and can be used across both the non-credit and credit space, and as I've said, with graduate programs. One thing I'm going to mention very, very quickly is that embedded within all of the 6 approaches, which I will be going over, is also looking at how to incorporate prior learning assessment and also thinking about auto-awarding, which is something that is just starting to grow in recognition in terms of how to make sure people are awarded these credentials. Next slide. So I'm just going to go through the 6 very quickly. The Learn As You Go approach is really focused on skill development. Some of the areas that we see at the graduate level includes key skills that are needed to be successful in reading, writing, and doing research, as well as other areas. And we're also seeing that some graduate programs offer a grad school kind of preparation course, which could result in a badge or a micro-credential or some other kind of credential. Next slide. Specialize As You Go is focused on specializations. There are already many graduate programs offering things like certificates of advanced studies, which is one type of incremental credential. And some institutions are creating micro-credentials in cognate areas or specialization areas. Next slide. As Matt was already talking about stacking, stack as you go is an area that we do hear a lot about it. And the concept really is that all credentials lead to either another credential or directly into professions. The thing about stacking is that it's purposeful and clearly articulated. And so the learners really know how one credential leads to the next and how it also can map into different fields. Some examples start with a micro-credential that leads to a certificate that can lead to a degree. Some institutions map these points to careers and position types. And some are discussing how to create doing ABD, all but dissertation credential, for those students who have not completed the dissertation, to give them formal recognition for what they already know and to encourage them to continue and finish the dissertation. Next slide. Transfer as you go focuses on how to articulate credentialing pathways across institutions. Some are developing credentials that meet both bachelor's and master's programs. There's lots of examples of things like 4+2 programs, fifth-year programs, and also master's to doctorate programs. But another possibility is to develop partnerships across institutions to offer students at one institution specializations from another institution without having to build out additional resources at the first institution. And so, kind of thinking about that idea of cross-registration, but at a graduate level. Next slide. Partner as you go works with different industry certifications, either to evaluate and provide credits for the certifications or to provide the certifications within the curriculum. There are many examples of advanced industry certifications at a grad level. For example, SHRM's course, Employee Relations Managing Employees in a Dynamic Work Environment, has been evaluated by the American Council on Education for 2 credits at the graduate level. At Keene State, the students in the Master's in Safety and Occupational Health Applied Sciences gained certified safety professional status recognized by the Board of Certified Safety Professionals. So we're seeing a lot of different ways of really integrating and connecting the academic and the workplace learning. And as I've already mentioned, some countries are offering apprenticeships at the graduate level in conjunction with industry partners. Next slide. The last approach is retro award as you go. According to the Council of Graduate Schools study on PhD completion, only about 56% of doctoral students complete. That means the remaining doctoral students have learning, but are not being recognized formally. Many will claim ABD status, but this is not a formal credential. And so one of the questions is, what if it became one? Also, as already mentioned, there are some institutions that are really thinking about going back and finding students that are partway through a program and doing some credentialing around what they've already acquired. There are some institutions evaluating prior learning for graduate credit and some developing smaller credentials to capture that prior learning that can stack into a certificate or a degree. All past students, regardless of their status, who successfully completed their statistics and research courses could be awarded a credential in analytical approaches, which then could stack into other credentials, but is valuable on its own. So this retro award is, we're seeing being combined with kind of a stacking idea, but making sure that past learning is brought forward. So this is a very quick overview of the framework. We encourage you to go to www.credentialasyogo.org, and I'll put that in the chat in a second, to learn more about incremental credentialing framework. Also, we've been doing different kinds of reports and tools and resources that are there that you might find interesting. And so now I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Holly Zanville, who is also one of the co-leads for Credential as You Go, who will be facilitating a panel to hear more about how this is happening at 3 institutions. Holly?
Thanks so much, Nan. I'm not sure if my camera's come on or not, but maybe it'll come on later. As we begin our panel, and if we could go to the next slide, that would really be helpful. we have put together a lot of what you've already heard from Nan and Matt about what are the general areas of development that are occurring in incremental credentialing at the graduate level. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of them, but I saw in chat, so some of you asked if you would be able, if you'll have access to this and later, and you'll have access to both the slides and the recording. So I want you to know that we're trying to capture a list of the kind of developments which are underway for you. So the next slide, as we get our panelists highlighted, I'm really pleased to introduce three panelists who are going to share with you some of the developments on the ground at their institutions. And there are things on the ground currently, and then there are things that are on the drawing board at the institutions as well. So our panel includes Graham Hamill from the Graduate School at University of Buffalo, Kristen Vancelo from Florida Gulf Coast University, and Stephen Schmidt from the University of Wisconsin, where he works with both the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and the University of Wisconsin system. All of these institutions are participating with the Credential as You Go initiative, and they're going to be sharing some examples of new incremental credentials at their institutions. So there are three questions that I'm going to try to get to, if we have the time, with each one. The first is, what is happening around incremental credentialing at your institution? The second question is, what do you have on the drawing board or in the planning stages? And the third is, what are the biggest challenges, the top 2 or 3 challenges and successes that you're seeing with incremental credentialing? So I'm going to have Graham, who does not have any slides, if he would go first, and maybe we can take the slide off and just go to live discussion.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks everybody. I'm really appreciative to be part of this webinar. It's a great opportunity to learn a lot about the innovative space of micro-credentials. So I'll just take each question one by one and offer a couple of thoughts. In terms of what's happening now on our campus, I think it would be helpful first to provide just a little bit of context. University at Buffalo has been offering for credit and non-credit micro-credentials since 2018, so a little more than 5 years. When we framed our initiatives, we wanted to make sure that we were aligned with our institutional values, and we put a significant amount of priority on the academic quality of micro-credentials, really framing the initiative as one that tried to align professional competencies across all disciplines with kind of academic enhancements. And that led us to embed our micro-credentialing initiative almost entirely in already existing curriculum governance structures and in enterprise-wide systems. So curriculum governance structures are local all the way to central approval processes for micro-credentials and enterprise-wide systems, things like our student information system. Non-matriculating students can take micro-credentials, but what we've seen is that the bulk of enrollment is really among students who are already pursuing degree programs. And I think that context is going to be important for everything I'm about to say. So currently we offer 49 graduate level micro-credentials, 25 are for credit and 24 are non-credit, so split almost 50-50. The micro-credentials range across 10 of our 12 schools, and there are also micro-credentials being offered in a couple of I'm not going to say non-academic, but non-decanal areas like student life and the libraries and the like. So in terms of what's happening on our campus, we're continuing to develop new micro-credentials. I'll say a little bit more about faculty and student interest in a few minutes, but we, on average, develop and offer about 10 new micro-credentials per year. We are seeing high enrollment in micro-credentials, and this is high enrollment among already existing students. So these are not new students coming to the institution by and large, but already existing students in degree programs. We're seeing high enrollment in our micro-credentials, and we really want to understand why, what's the attraction among our students. So in addition to developing micro-credentials, we're also collecting data from students through surveys to better understand student interest in this kind of credentialing. We're seeing some really interesting trends among the faculty development of micro-credentials, and I'll just highlight two that really stand out to us. One is that there has recently been significant growth in the development of microcredentials that focus on community engagement. So I'll just give an example or two of what I mean by that. Our medical school has developed a non-credit microcredential called Diabetes Mentoring. This is student-led and doctor-patient supported program where students acquire a working knowledge of diabetes and diabetes management and treatment, with special emphasis placed on assisting those in underserved populations. Another example would be our School of Dental Medicine has developed a credit-bearing microcredential called Competencies in Dental Public Health, which provides students the opportunity to participate in community-based services and research with health providing organizations across Western New York. An example would be something like Indian Health Services. And the third example, just to give something that's not from the health sciences, our College of Arts and Sciences has developed a grant writing and fundraising microcredential, which is credit bearing. And in this microcredential, students write and submit grants for local nonprofits, and they might be in the arts or they might be in other areas. So we've seen growth in the faculty development of microcredentials that focus on student engagement and learning that comes from student engagement. We're also seeing growth in microcredentials that certify DEI competencies. And of the 49 microcredentials that we currently offer, 10 of these specifically address intercultural and global competencies and a critical understanding of DEI. And these are very specific to disciplines. So there are some in STEM fields like engineering, there's some in health sciences fields, and there's some in fields that are neither of those. In terms of what we have on the drawing board, we are certainly continuing to work on growing our portfolio of professional development microcredentials for graduate students. Some of these are in very sort of discipline-specific areas, such as pharmacy or medicine, or other disciplines. And some of these are general and serve all graduate students across all degree programs. So, for example, we have 2 new microcredentials that are associated with the 3-minute thesis training that students can participate in to the training they participate in to engage in the 3-minute thesis process. Nan mentioned that some graduate schools are offering microcredentials that prepare incoming graduate students for future success, and we've just developed a microcredential that does exactly that. So we have one of the things we have on the drawing board where we continue to develop new microcredentials. We are also in the process of developing a toolkit of assessment instruments to better understand ROI from the perspective of institutional effectiveness, and from the perspective of the value of microcredentials to students. We are very interested in longitudinal measurements or measures to understand the value of microcredentials for students over time and for the institution over time. And we're working in partnership with our Graduate School of Education on that project. It's very early days, but we're working on student surveys and developing other data points that we would want to collect. And finally, on the drawing board, we have received funding from the SUNY system to develop several new microcredentials that are developed in strong collaboration with industry partnerships. One of these focuses specifically on institutional research officers. We're working with institutional research officers from across higher education institutions in New York State to develop microcredentials that provide professional training in IR-related areas. We're also working in partnership with a local entrepreneurship organization that's called Tech Buffalo, and with a local bank to develop a microcredentials for learners interested in developing entrepreneurial skills. And then the final question, in terms of successes and challenges, I'd like to give 3 successes and 3 challenges just to wrap up. In terms of successes, when we began this initiative in 2018, we focused on undergraduate students and graduate students. We did not anticipate the amount of interest we would see among graduate and professional students. But as it ends up, graduate and professional students end up being the bulk of enrollment and the bulk of microcredential development at the University at Buffalo. So I think that's a real success and a little bit of a surprise for us. The second success has to do with faculty interest. We were unsure how faculty would respond to this micro-credentialing initiative. And I would say I am delighted by the number of faculty who have or are developing micro-credentials and the range of faculty across disciplinary expertise who have been interested in, have participated in this initiative. In our model, the micro-credentialing portfolio is almost entirely faculty driven. In terms of developing micro-credentials and also entirely in terms of approving micro-credentials. We've seen significant curricular innovation, and in a lot of ways, I see micro-credentialing as a kind of sandbox area for low-stakes curricular innovation among the faculty that can then be imported into degree programs. We've also seen a number of faculty build micro-credentials into grant proposals where the micro-credential is the basis of a grant, for example, scaling experiential learning through incremental certification, but also building micro-credentials into grants where grant elevates and certifies the training experiences that graduate students go through as they participate in the research on the grant. Third area of success, we have seen real success well, let me take a step back. Every one of our micro-credentials is also awarded a digital badge. And in the digital badge, the evidence of achieving the learning outcomes is present in the digital badge and can be shared broadly across various platforms. We've seen real success with this digital badge component. We've seen very, very high rates of claiming the digital badges. And this makes me think that there really is an opportunity here to rethink the transcript and move more towards a comprehensive learner record. And I know a couple of people in the chat were mentioning that. I fully agree that there's an opportunity here. In terms of challenges, I'll just mention three very briefly. It has been a challenge for us facilitating partnerships, meaningful partnerships with industry and employers. This is an ongoing challenge. And I would say, I think this is a general challenge when it comes to curriculum development. With micro-credentialing, we are partnering with our campus entrepreneurial center to offer workshops to help faculty bring workforce development concerns into the development of micro-credentialing, but I think there's more we could do here. Second thing, and a couple of Matt mentioned this, and Dan also talked about this issue. We have had no real scalable success with stackable degrees. Non-matriculating students who are interested in micro-credentials, we found are not really interested in attaining the degree and do not tend to see micro-credentialing as a pathway to the degree. And I should say that's not been our focus, but that is, so it could be because it's not our focus, we haven't seen real success there, but that is what we are seeing. I would say, in terms of stackable degrees, that faculty thinking about making a master's degree stackable has led to curricular improvement for degree-seeking students. That is, it's led to degree revisions that have made the master's degrees better, I think. But it has not led to new pathways into and through the degrees. Now, I want to offer a caveat that students are claiming more than one micro-credential. So I think there is evidence that students really like the customizability of learning, but they're not stackable into a particular degree. Also, Matt mentioned in his part of the webinar what he was calling light interdisciplinarity. Micro-credentials have the opportunity to provide students with competencies and to signal competencies that they may not want to pursuing another degree. And I think there's something going on there too with micro-credentialing. Third challenge, and I'll just conclude with this, and it's really our biggest challenge, is measuring and communicating the value of the micro-credential. What is the return on investment? For students, does participation in a micro-credential impact career readiness? Does it lead to improved career outcomes? Or is it the case that students who pursue micro-credentials in our model tend to be more motivated and have better career outcomes for other reasons? For the institution, does micro-credentials improve student learning, the effectiveness of teaching? Does it lead to curricular innovation? I think there are early signs that maybe that's the case, but we really don't know the answer to that. And then for employers, is there a market value to micro-credentials? That's a question we're very interested in getting the answer to. and we simply don't know. So with that, I'll conclude, and Holly, turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Graham. So much in what is going on at Buffalo that we all want to learn from. And Credentials Go is getting a lot of questions about return on investment. So this is a topic we're going to be taking on in larger scale in the next several months. So I'm going to call on Stephen next and just move through the the 3 questions as you can. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for inviting us, UW-Milwaukee and the Universities of Wisconsin today. My name is Stephen Schmid. I serve, as mentioned, in 2 roles. I serve in the provost office at UW-Milwaukee, as well as with the University of Wisconsin system in the academic affairs office. My colleagues, I've had the pleasure of working in the provost office for several years with my colleagues, Laura Pedrick and Phyllis King. They are the real masterminds behind UW-Milwaukee's micro-credential initiative. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it today. Phyllis is somewhere in the Southern Hemisphere vacationing, and Laura, I think, is presenting in a different webinar right now. So I wanted to just kind of give our journey, and if you'll skip to the next slide, please. Our journey started in micro-credentials in fall of 2021, so not near as far back as Graham's. And what I kind of want to focus on is some of our process. If you go to the next slide too, just go ahead to the journey map, please. This kind of gives a little diagram of how Milwaukee pursued their opportunity in micro-credentials. Milwaukee has a lot of experience in the online space with a very robust online program. We're also very heavily invested in competency-based education. And so micro-credentials certificates are not kind of a new territory, but it is kind of an extension of and embellishment of much of our past work. So in our process, we put together basically a work group back in fall of 21. This work group looked at SUNY's work in the micro-credential space to get an understanding of guiding principles, fit, design principles. And these were guideposts for us as we pursued many of the principles that we've talked about today, but also kind of fashioned our policies and our practices. In particular, quality, developing micro-credentials for market needs, looking at how micro-credentials would dovetail into our industry partnerships, and we have several, portability of micro-credentials, as well as stackability of micro-credentials. And if you will go into the next slide, I believe is the policy slide. We came out of this process with some pretty robust micro-credential policy. This is part of our shared governance process and our academic kind of policy approval process that we have these guidelines in place. If you'll move to the next slide, please. And I provide this as an opportunity for folks when these slides are presented. You can even Google this if you like. We have web pages basically set up in academic affairs that provide access to our institutional policies, as well as a faculty toolkit. This faculty toolkit doesn't focus as much on what Graham had mentioned as far as assessment toolkit, but it provides a toolkit for faculty in the thinking about and developing micro-credentials within their academic programs. So a lot of our policy focused on the short form, right? 6 to 12 credits. We have both graduate and undergraduate. We have certain limits on transferability that are a result of the nature of our micro-credentials in our institutions. We try to reduce the administrative burden of micro-credentials, and we focused on competencies. This is not something that's particularly right because of our CBE work and our competency-based kind of metrics. We wanted to make sure that when we think about these micro-credentials, that they have career-ready competencies built into them and understood and quite explicit. And so these are all part of the process. As we were building this policy, we also worked through the shared governance process, getting a lot of buy-in, and I'll talk about that in a second here. But we also developed, like Graham mentioned, a badging platform building off of the Canvas learning management system. So using the Canvas badges, individuals, students who complete their micro-credential can apply for receiving a badge, and digitally embedded into that badge is information about the competencies, about the micro-credential, the program it was in, et cetera. And so generating buy-in, if I'll have you skip to the next one, if you don't mind. One of the things, and I wanted to just focus on this because you know, in a shared governance environment, the question becomes, is anybody going to be interested? One of the ways to sell this, of course, is to ask the students if they're interested in micro-credentials and how likely they are to participate them, take them, or kind of pursue them. And so a couple little slides here. A lot of our graduate students thought that they would be moderately or extremely likely to take a micro-credential. If you go to the next slide, please. Many of our graduate students thought that they would receive a moderate or find these micro-credentials very beneficial. And then if you will go on to the next one, please. When asked about future graduate students, right, when we asked our current graduate students and undergrads whether they thought the future undergrads or our grad students would find these appealing, a lot of them said they thought the micro-credentials would be very appealing. And so just at least internally, right, our sense is that students want to see these opportunities, they want to pursue them. And so we are building those out as we go. And next slide, please. What do we have on the drawing board? And if you'll flip to the next one. Sorry, I forgot I had questions transitioned. So what do we have on the drawing board? As I said, we just started this process back in the fall of 21. Policy was approved about a little less than a year ago, spring of 23. And right now in the pipeline, we have about 24 micro-credentials going through the academic shared governance process. And that gives you a sense of where these stand. Like what Graham mentioned, some of these are community engagement activities, anti-racist education, DEI education, peace education. Some of them are more business focused or kind of can apply to the business community. And then some of them are much more specific to particular industries, in particular healthcare, social work, education. We anticipate, and I should mention that about 40% of the ones that are in the pipeline right now are specifically for graduate programs. We expect another dozen or so, 10 to 12 in the next year that will be implemented for fall of 25. And next slide, please. What does system have on the drawing board? I think other direction, please. There we go. So, okay, we can work with that. So what do we have on the drawing board? We have what we call the Career Pathways Initiative at Milwaukee. This is an effort that is attempting to take what we know about students, their interest in short form learning, about their desires and their abilities to blend both formal and informal learning. We're looking at our partnerships and what our industry partners in our community are expecting from us. And then we're thinking about how education and learning in general is changing probably throughout the individual learners and career kind of trajectory. And so we have 3 areas right now where our Career Pathways Initiative is focusing. One of these is the School of Continuing Education through non-credit micro-credentials. We have multiple strategic partnerships that are already in place, and this short form learning of micro-credentials is of great interest to them with our industry partners as well as with other higher education partners. And then micro-credentials are kind of a fundamental piece of that process and that puzzle. If you go back a couple more, we've skipped ahead a couple here. One of the other direction, please. One of the areas that we wanted to highlight on the industry partnership and the micro-credentials and our Career Pathways Initiative is we have an organization that was stood up several years ago called HERA, the Higher Education Regional Alliance. HERA is a collaboration of 17 southeastern Wisconsin public and private 2- and 4-year colleges and universities Also includes a network of community and economic development partners. And what HERA has been basically, its main goals are trying to get students to complete college and get academic credentials, innovations in curriculum, as well as expanding the talent bridges with employers. And so HERA is working with all these 17 institutions have stood up a website, which you can see right here. The website is the microcredentialing catalog, and institutions, all of these 17 institutions are able to load up their microcredential and provide information about those microcredentials. Milwaukee has populated this website now with many of its non-credit microcredentials, and plans are to populate it with its credit-bearing microcredentials as those are developed. And many of the microcredentials are looking at skill sets and knowledge acquisition in high-demand employer areas. And HERA is also as a collaborative relationship between Milwaukee, the Northwestern Mutual Data Science Institute, the Milwaukee School of Engineering, and the Waukesha County Technical College are working on developing a collaborative AI module that will be a microcredential that will be available through this website, as well as through these and credited through these institutions. Milwaukee does plan on providing kind of credit as prior learning credit for many of these microcredentials, non-credit microcredentials as they grow and develop. And then next slide, if you will, please. So from the system perspective, we're looking at microcredentials to pursue an initiative we have in online growth. And this is a system-wide initiative that was pursued all last year and is slowly being implemented this year. Microcredentials are seen as opportunities for our UW institutions to connect with employers throughout the state. And we have several different activities, initiatives going on that are related in this area. So we have an individual who's working with workforce partners to develop kind of a needs assessment to determine what kind of microcredentials and certificates are of greatest need to them, as well as working with all of our UWs and collaborating with them, as well as some grants that we have that we're pursuing where we're building out certificates and credentials for workforce development. So challenges and needs, if you'll skip, I believe it's 2 more at this point, not the third one, the question, but the 4th, challenges and needs. Many of the challenges and needs I know are in the chat that we've been seeing coming up, and Graham also mentioned as well. One of the challenges from a system perspective is that microcredentials, like certificates, and right now we have more than 850 certificates throughout the 13 universities of the UW system. It's hard to understand or hard to know exactly where all these certificates land. Are they all fundamentally connected into a degree program and you have to be enrolled in that degree program? Are they ones that you must be enrolled in some degree program at a UW institution in order to take the certificate? Or are you able to take these certificates and ultimately microcredentials online? And so one of our challenges from a system perspective is simply to understand and to have the data of all these different certificates and how they're being used throughout our UWs. One of the opportunities that we see is that once we have this understanding, we'll be able to meet our workforce needs much better throughout the state, and generate employer awareness about what types of microcredentials and certificates are available. I should mention that right now, Milwaukee is the only UW institution that has, to my knowledge, I think it's going to change soon, but the only UW institution that has shared governance academic policies in place for microcredentials. We expect that that will change here in the next semester or 2 as more institutions build out their microcredential offerings. And I will probably end with that. Many of the questions that we have from our campuses about microcredentials is just viability, return on investment, and many of the other items that Graham brought up. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Such great stuff going on. So Kristen, go fast.
I will. I can be
You wanna
quick.
sort of time.
Hello from sunny Southwest Florida. My name is Kristen Vancello, and as you know, I have the pleasure of overseeing our microcredentials and digital badges here at our university. Just for context and very quickly, FGCU is part of the State University System of Florida, governed by the Board of Governors of Florida, and we are 26 years new. So while we are extremely proud of our innovation, we have been very surprised by some of the traditions that that we have really held close and dear to us as a newer institution. Just for context, we have just over 16,000 students enrolled at our institution this academic year, with 64 undergraduate programs and 26 master's programs, 7 doctoral programs. And in the interest of time, we're going to jump right into the next slide and talk about what we've done in incremental credentialing through our microcredentials and digital badges. Like my peers today, we really dove deep into this work beginning in 2019, with our first microcredentials being offered in 2020. The first and most important thing that we did was define microcredentials for FGCU. So that is the mastery of specific competencies and skills, but they are defined alongside employers and community partners. And the digital badge is simply that emblem or that credential that can be shared very broadly and widely once earned by a learner. Please advance to the next slide. So this is just an example. We also use the Canvas Learning Management System and Canvas Credentials in order to administer our digital badges. And so that metadata is what is critical and part of our conversations across higher ed when it comes to looking at students' learning records as well. But it gives that more transparent view of competencies, skills, and activities that the students mastered in order to earn this credential. Moving on to the next slide, I'll share some examples. So we term our model the power of and. Our microcredentials exist outside of our curriculum, whether they're designed for our graduate students or graduate level students versus members of the community or undergraduate students. So I'm focusing more on graduate because of our topic of the day. But this is an example of how we have an industry-specific version of a microcredential where we really engage with our employers in the region to determine what are the competencies and skills that are needed that are aligned with areas of curricular expertise at FGCU. And so what will transpire is that someone from the community will enroll, whether they're degree seeking or not, for something in a broader scale, they'll enroll at FGCU in order to complete a course or series of courses. Once they meet a qualifier that's defined and decided between our faculty along with employer partners, then our students would have the opportunity at the graduate level to go on for the microcredential curriculum and to earn a digital badge. So they first complete a course which maintains that academic integrity and is certainly something that is assessed by our faculty. But then we bring the employers and our partners in to the process. So the microcredential content is created hand in hand with our community or industry partner. In this case, we're talking about instructional technology. So our employer partners are the superintendents and their staff at the 5 regional school districts in our area. But what will occur is that the student will be given the opportunity to really apply the skills and the competencies that they learned through our curriculum and create some sort of an assessment or project or presentation that we then engage the employers in assessing alongside our faculty. And what has been extremely successful for each of our credentials in the microcredential world is that our employers are so involved with us that they have always guaranteed an interview or a promotional opportunity to the students who go through these programs. So if you'll slide to the next slide. This is a second example that's in the field of education where we are offering a non-credit microcredential through our continuing education lens. And so through this, we are offering post-baccalaureate level curriculum for an endorsement that is required within the state of Florida for our K-12 teachers. And so we have individuals that are able to enroll in a non-credit course at FGCU that allows us to shift the cost that would be passed along to the user in order to earn their professional development certificate. But if they meet that credential very much the same way in the credit-based curricular model, we allow them the opportunity to also earn a digital badge where they've actually applied what they've learned, and they've done that in a real world environment within the school district. Shifting to the next slide, what I want to show is that we also have looked at how we could connect with a series of courses in nursing and nurse education. And so we have combined 3 graduate level courses that are offered as part of a certificate and ultimately a degree in nurse educator, an MSN program at our institution. But upon completion of the 3 courses, the Essentials of a Nurse Educator badge is something that our students are eligible to earn. And what that does is allow them to immediately serve as a clinical coordinator or an adjunct faculty member or take on other roles of importance to both the health system and the institution. Next slide. This is another example of how that then stacks into a degree at FGCU. So I showed you the nurse educator microcredential, which was 3 of the courses on the left side of the screen. When the additional credit hours are completed by our students, they're eligible for that post-baccalaureate certificate. Then those stack into the 38 credit hour content that's associated with our MSN and nurse educator program. So you can see that stackability from microcredential, as Nan and others have spoken about as one of those models. It's the stackability of the microcredential into the certificate into the MS degree program. And then I have one more example to show you from our School of Entrepreneurship. Very similarly, we offer an entrepreneurial mindset digital badge, but then we also have 12 credits in a post-baccalaureate certificate program that should a student want to continue on for the MS degree, those all will stack with them towards that next credential. One last slide for FGCU, and I know I'm going so quickly that I'm forgetting a lot of critical and key information I'd love to share with you, but this is an example of where we are really specifically and intentionally aligning the non-credit content that we're offering at the post-baccalaureate level to our curriculum so that we have that opportunity in order to use credit for prior learning so that should they want to stack later from a non-credit into a credit-bearing credential at our institution, we have that pathway and it's clearly defined from day one for our learners in the community. So what I will do is share with my colleagues in the chat a couple of links to our policy that we've developed at the institution for both credit for prior learning and our microcredentials and digital badges, as well as our website so that you can peruse and reach out to me with any additional questions you may have. And I hope that was quick enough.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Kristen. And don't worry, everyone, we're going to be putting together a lot of written materials, and we're probably going to move into some case studies of these institutions. So you all have this at a later time because these are so packed full. So now I'm really pleased to introduce Julie Masterson. And Julie, thank you for doing the wrap up for us. Julie is at Missouri State University, and she's going to respond to some of what she heard. And luckily, she was able to look at the slides beforehand. So Julie, you're next.
Well, I'm going to do this in 5 minutes. So everybody get ready to put your seatbelts on. We're going to go quickly. I want to first tell you that MSU has been offering graduate certificates since 2000. That's 24 years if you want to do the quick math. And we have close to 200, not quite 200 on our books. Now, certainly my predecessor as grad dean was innovative, but as you can imagine, we have and continue to need to go through various developmental stages regarding sensitivity, et cetera, many of the issues that were brought up today. As illustrated by Holly, Nan, and everyone on this presentation, microcredentials have so much potential. Institutions, that means faculty, are still, though, at varied points in their perspectives on microcredentials, yet they are the driving forces. So the comments and examples from Graham and Stephen and Kristen today give me hope in that area. I'm excited. There are tremendous benefits to microcredentials. They can be nimble and sensitive mechanisms to respond to emerging workforce demands. So in our case, this sounds a lot like what Kristen was talking about and others. Our state needed additional teachers who were experts in teaching math. So we happened to have a graduate certificate, elementary specialist in mathematics. We happened to have one. It was serendipitous. So they could slip right into that. And we had tremendous participation in that program. At the same time, the state also needed teachers with advanced literacy training, and we did not have a graduate certificate in that. Fortunately, we did have an individualized graduate certificate. So if you remember nothing else that I say, please remember this, that if you can have a mechanism in place to we call it individualized, something that's generic, so that as these emerging needs and opportunities arise, you can use that mechanism to meet them. So you need something like an individualized certificate, and then you need a director of that individualized certificate who's willing to experiment and be able to go very quickly into an opportunity. It's a low-risk strategy. I can't remember who said this. I think maybe Stephen did, to test proof of concept for new academic programs. Again, some sort of individualized structure allows you to test it. Then when you submit the program for approval at your university level, state, et cetera level, you have data that show that we have student interest and even outcomes of students who have gone through that particular curriculum. It's also a way to ensure that there are cheerleaders, advocates for components of interdisciplinary degrees. Matt referred to this as pathway signaling or interdisciplinary light. Interdisciplinary sounds great, but when you just cluster courses together without a faculty advocate or an advisor in those areas for the student, sometimes that student can get lost and not get the direction that she needs. And then Suzanne mentioned something that is incredibly important to me. This provision of access to graduate education has been really, really useful and crucial here at MSU. We have used this for students who may not have the necessary undergraduate GPA to start a degree, but maybe that was 20 years ago. They're a different person now. Maybe they didn't even know that undergraduate degree made a difference later. They got what they needed to get to graduate, to play sports, whatever, but now the bar is higher and they really have the potential to do it. They just need to prove it. So I like being in a graduate certificate so much more than just wandering around as some sort of post-baccalaureate or non-degree seeking student. So that's all the good stuff. That important question that Suzanne raised too, about quality, that's the piece that we really need to address. Matt mentioned that the NACE 2023 data indicate that microcredentials offered by higher education are viewed as having the highest quality. So we don't want to blow this. We want to make sure that what we're offering maintains the standards that are associated with our higher education institutions. In the typical assessment measures aren't going to be what we usually do, like enrollment and completion. And again, I think what we heard from our panelists today indicates that folks are taking this seriously and already building that in. So that's very, very good news. Employer satisfaction, student career incomes and outcomes, and that may mean success in pursuing further graduate study, as we've talked about earlier, maybe just getting into a PhD. Whatever those outcomes are, we need mechanisms to be able to track that. And then finally, I will speak about the gainful employment requirements. I try not to break out in hives when I mention this, because this will be a burden and a tremendous responsibility on us as we go forward offering these. Someone asked about it in chat. I put the link to the CGS guidance, which is incredibly helpful on this. There's a related article by Mike Nitzel in Forbes. And my bottom line for you is that I would encourage you to work very closely with your legal counsel office at your university, because those are the folks that are going to be telling you how not only graduate deans, but other offices will need to comply with this this resurrected regulation. So I think I did that in about 4 minutes. I'll turn it right back over to you, Holly.
And it's going, thank you so much. And it's going back to Matt.
Well, thanks so much, Julie, and thank you to all the presenters today for your wonderful contributions. And thank you to the audience for your attention. Just a couple final notes as we wrap up today's webinar. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to the audience Q&A, but there will be ample follow-up to this webinar in the forms of email communications. My email's in the slide deck. So once that's circulated, please feel free to get in contact with me, and I can get in contact with the rest of our panelists if there are any questions that went unanswered. Please always visit the CGS website, cgsnet.org. Subscribing to the News Network newsletter is one of the best ways to stay in contact about upcoming programming from CGS. And also be sure to visit the Credential As You Go website, credentialasyogo.org, to see their wonderful suite of resources on this important topic. Keep an eye out for the CGS microcredentials report. It should be coming out in the next week to 2 weeks. And we look forward to sharing even more information from you. But again, thank you for joining us, and look out for a whole suite of resources coming your way following up this webinar, including the webinar recording, the slides, and the transcript. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you next time for the next CGS webinar. Thank you.